for joining us today. My name is Daniel Jimenez. I'm the leader of the Community of Practice on Data-Driven Agronomy. I'm pleased to see you all attending on our Wednesday morning here in Colombia and Mexico. So welcome to the first out of 4 webinars that we are organizing on the topic ingredients of scaling. So one of the objectives of the Community of Practice on Data-Driven Agronomy is communicate collective action on a particular topic across the CGIAR or beyond the CGIAR on big data, with our partners. And that is precisely what we want to do today in this webinar. So bringing virtually colleagues to share their experiences on scaling their different projects in different geographies. I have just one question for all of us. We're getting messages on our window chat. So, but can everyone hear us and see that? If there's someone that cannot see us or hear us, please let us know. Okay. Good, loud and clear. I'm reading. Great. So, a little bit of background on the idea of this webinar is that, on considering the topic for this webinar, it started last year when we had a session on our big data convention in India. And we ran also a blog contest on the topic on digital extension. And we realized how researchers across the CGI are working on research for development struggle to scale out some of our projects. So it seems that many of us working on that at some point we've been frustrated when we see that we have a great initiative that we started with solid science behind, with farmers already engaged, and then for some reason it stops because we don't have more funding. There is no involvement of people that can provide financial sustainability, no good business planning. So it basically never got to the scale it was intended. But as this is not the space to share my personal frustrations, so better to listen to the people that can give us some hope on this. So for this webinar entitled "The Meaningful of Scaling," the what and why, we will have 2 presentations, 50 minutes each, and then we will have a wrap up and Q&A session. The first presenter is Lennart Woltering from the International Maize and Wheat Improvement Center. He's a scaling catalyst. He'll talk about why we should move from scaling more to a more meaningful way of scaling that integrates sustainability, systems change, and responsible scaling. And then we will have Diana Giraldo, a researcher from the Alliance of Bioversity International and CIAT and the University of Reading. And she will present an example of meaningful scaling of technical Agro-Climatic Committees to 10 countries in Latin America in a sustainable way. So let's get started, and I'll hand over to Lennart now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, and thank you so much for the this opportunity to speak at this very big platform. I saw that you have 230 people participating, or at least registering. I'm Lennart Woltering. I work for CIMMYT. I'm also the chair of another community of practice working group on scaling. So this really started, let's say, a few years ago when Larry Cooley and Johannes Lin, I think the godfathers of scaling, I think people that know the literature, they said there are so many organizations that are struggling with this. Let's have a group around this so that we can work on this. And they started this community of practice, and we have quite a few members now, a few hundreds, not as big as the big data platform, but I think we're slowly getting there. And I'm very happy that we are joining the 2 groups. Are you seeing the screen properly, or do you see the moderation screen, Daniel? Is it okay? If not, I
can see it, Lennart.
All right, excellent.
I
thanks.
see the moderation.
So I'm also, do you see the moderation screen? Okay.
Yeah.
Let me shift to the other screen. Better?
Perfect, Lennart.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay. So scaling, the dominant use of scaling, and I think you've all recognized this, is that we have a continuum of a discovery. And since I'm working for CIMMYT, we might as well talk about the discovery of a maize seed, right? Then we move to a proof of concept. So we try it out in our center and say, okay, this is a fantastic variety. Then we do piloting, and then we take some of those seeds to villages around. And then the next obvious step is scaling, right? That's how we design the things. But we realize actually that the steps between discovery, proof of concept and piloting are pretty obvious, and we know how to do it well. But if we move from piloting to scaling, there's a very big black box of assumptions and really not really knowing what's going on. And it's not only us, it turns out that it's a kind of like the whole world is struggling with this in urban planning, in health, in education, and in basically every sector. Scaling is a big thing. And people say, you know, the pilots, they never fail. They're great, but the pilots also never scale. And never means kind of like 95% of the cases, things don't really scale to a level that we intend to, or think they can scale to. Right? And I just want to talk to you about two major problems. And this presentation is really a primer for the series of webinars that we have in store for you on the science of scaling, on the art of scaling, and more on the practice of scaling, really live examples. These are a series of webinars. And this is really to kind of like prime you to ask the pertinent questions in those kind of discussions. And also maybe in your institute or where you work, to be the kind of like the nagging person asking them the nagging questions, right? So the first one, the first major problem is this pilot versus the real world environment. And the second major problem around this is the tension between two scaling paradigms. And I'll just go into those now. So the first one, most pilot projects are really operated in very controlled environments. They have very strong leadership. Mostly they have projects coming in with external experts, highly paid international experts. They set up their own camps, let's say, often in parallel to the local system. They support partnerships. They provide a lot of incentives for people to partner, to value chain actors to participate. And of course, they rely on sustainable grounds with a fixed starting time and a fixed end time, right? And maybe more importantly, they're all shielded from politics, from market forces, etc. So it's kind of like operating in a glass house, right? And there are two common strategies how we go to scale, how we go from that pilot environment, the controlled pilot environment, let's say the greenhouse, to scale. And these are arguments that you can win tenders with and proposals with, and you can convince donors. If you say these things, you probably get the funding that you want, right? The first one, you just do a bigger project, right? You make a bigger glass house. Well, the second is you say, well, our innovation is so great, it will scale from itself. No need to do much more. We basically just remove the glass house and we go into the real world. Now, what we've learned is that a successful pilot is no guarantee for a success at scale at all. You cannot just extrapolate what happens in a pilot project to the real world at scale. You just push with your existing model a bit harder, things will not go better, right? Or it will also work at the other scale and in other locations. Major reason is that impact at scale requires very different skills, very different approaches, and very different ways of collaboration. And this is really where the gist of the scaling is. And this is what the webinars are all about. What different skills, what different approaches, what different ways of collaboration. It's kind of like, I'd like to explain this a little bit with an example of a lady on a bicycle. And maybe from my accent you heard I'm from the Netherlands. And this lady happens to be the queen of the Netherlands. I don't know if there are royalists among us. We have 230 participants. There should be at least a few fans. So she's very happy on her bike. She's riding on, even on the grass there, no problem. And she can take a few more people on board, right? Maybe 3 more and some groceries. But if she really wants to scale more, she probably has to get a driver's license, move from the bicycle lane to the road, learn how to drive properly, and then you can take many more people. Then, of course, you get into your limitations of what you can carry with that car, right? And then you need to move, okay, maybe I need to buy a bus or get a bus and get a bus driver's license, get acquainted with how the rules and regulations of those bus stops to get more people on board. And then you can go and again to another limitation. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that innovations, they respond to new system dynamics at different levels. So this bicycle might work well, but you cannot have a bicycle that can carry as many people as the bus can, right? So you need to change models. You need to change also the way that you work. You need a driver's license. You need to other things that can enable you to basically carry that capacity, carry that scale. And another very important thing is that context is king. And this is true for both environments, both in the pilot environment, basically the environment where you test the things. The fact that the thing is so successful as you think it is, or you basically prove it is in your evidence, is also because of that context. In many cases, we also test our innovations with lead farmers or richer farmers. There's a lot of documentation about this, that in many cases we're actually not spreading or trying to create the impact with the kind of target beneficiaries, as we call them, that we're actually aiming for, because we're looking at different kind of dynamics, right? So the same is true in the real world. The context is going to be king. So the innovation is part, or the technology is part of a social system that basically determines if it works or not. So one important learning from this is that you never get into the glass house. It's way too comfortable. So really try to scale, or try to pilot things in as much as a real world environment as you can. The second thing is a tension between paradigms. And I think maybe you all used it, myself included. If you put the word scaling, people say, ah, this is going to be great. It's going to be bigger. It's going to be better. It's like a magical word, right? But we have to be very careful, because we don't want to raise expectations that we're not meeting. We have to be honest about what we can and what we cannot do. So a thing is, what is important is that one of the first paradigms, and this is definitely the most dominant one, and this is, let's say, on the left side of the spectrum, is the commercial paradigm. And these ideas of scaling, basically we borrow them from the Industrial Revolution, from the startup growths here nearby in California and in Silicon Valley. Growth, and more is better. So this is a paradigm, very strong paradigm about scaling. Very logistically focused, right? How do you get this thing out? How do we scale this to as many people as possible? Now, there's more and more voices out there saying, well, maybe this doesn't really fit to us. I'm talking about an organization like CIMMYT. It's a publicly funded research institute for the poor. It has a very social objective. We are a public institute. So maybe we should really focus more on the social impact and around SDGs. So we should really focus on scaling the positive impact that the innovation creates for people and the environment. Not only the people, but also the environment. So it's not so much about the innovation anymore. It's not so much about the innovation program or scaling the program, scaling the project, because they may not always be good for the people or for the environment. And this is a very interesting book that I recommend here on the site, Scaling Impact. The next webinar will be organized by them. So also come join that one. On those two different views, so the one, let's put a fist there, like an innovation push. We're pushing the innovation into a system. We want to sell as many bottles of Coca-Cola as possible, right? So it's very oriented towards outputs and solving barriers for end user adoption. So make sure that people, we say the enabling environment, create an enabling environment so that Coca-Cola can be bought, right? The other one, the systems pool on the other side of the spectrum, is very much looking at organizational and institutional dynamics that obstruct basically the outcome. So what you want to achieve, let's say the poverty, etc. So it's not so much anymore about this particular innovation, but about the outcome that you're trying to reach. And I think we're all familiar with the way that we do our theories of change, etc. The innovation push, basically you get away with a very simple, a linear way of saying, okay, well, if you do this intervention, then you have this change and then you have this outcome. But the reality is, of course, and that's kind of what you do in the system change and system thinking schools, is say, well, we are aware that it is a very complex thing, and our intervention is a piece of a much bigger puzzle, of which we don't even know more than half of the things that are going on. In the end, if the outcome happens, it's very difficult to say if it's basically due to our intervention, right? So it's kind of like a perfect storm of things coming together, which we don't even have influence on, that basically make that change. The innovation push is very focused on beneficiaries or end users adopting. And the other one is very much about incentives for all the actors, political level, value chain actors, to say, well, this is a great thing. This is a great thing that we want to support. More is better, and here it's very much about responsible scaling. And I just want to say a word about this. I'm really happy that this is getting more attention also. I mean, especially in agriculture, if you look at scaling, and if you look at the effects, for example, fertilizer use, the effects on the environment, irrigation is the biggest water user, fresh water user in the world. There are limitations to what we think should be done, right? There's limitations to growth. And this is very true for agriculture. So there's responsible scaling, looks a little bit at, okay, do no harm, also socially leave no one behind. Are we not basically kicking women out of the markets, for example, or are we giving them more work, etc.? So scaling should be responsible. More is not always better. And what you see as a result of those two models, these are the two extremes, right? So I'm really pushing it to the left. Well, this innovation push has resulted a lot in piecemeal innovation and impact during the project lifetime. So a lot of great impact during the project lifetime, then it goes down quickly, right? The other problem with the system is that it's very difficult to say, okay, did we actually do something, right? So somewhere in the middle. So are they two different views? What happens is in many projects, you start with, okay, we have this fantastic innovation, let's get this to scale. And we push it, and then we realize, hey, we're actually part of a system. How do we actually make the system absorb this kind of innovation, or even other innovations that might be just doing the same thing as we are trying to do? So they're not that separate from each other. There are tensions between the two, and that basically determines how far do you want to be. Do you want to be on the innovation push, or do you want to be on the system pool? And one of the tensions is, okay, what can you do as an organization, right? What is within your sphere of control? What is within your sphere of influence? And what is within your sphere of interest, right? Not all organizations are fit to take the whole system, to tackle basically all systemic issues, right? Maybe another very big issue, and this is a discussion you will always have if you talk about scaling, is about attribution and contribution. Are you willing to basically let go of that idea of, okay, the attribution that I did this and that's why this is a great result? Or do we understand, okay, we are part of a much bigger thing and we are basically external people intervening into local systems often, and the most we can do is contribution. And this flows into the next issue. The challenge really is, okay, what is success? And how do you monitor that? How do you prove to your donors or to your constituents that you did something useful, right? And lastly is the local organizational and institutional capacities. A lot of the issues around scaling really depend on the local ownership, and really playing as an international organization or as an external organization, more like a catalyst or a facilitator of processes, and not doing stuff for them and okay, handing over to them like, okay, now it's your turn. It's really about local capacity to take this forward. So yeah, I kind of feel we are not at that tipping point yet. We're still very comfortable in pushing innovations. A lot of organizations are climbing that hill, but it's very difficult to really embrace that system view and really go over that topping point and really have a very different perspective on international development and how we can play a role in that. The good news, scaling is a thing. I think if you would ask maybe gender specialist 50 years ago, okay, well, would you like to be a gender expert in this organization? People would say no, because no, everybody does gender. We involve women. We also train women, of course, right? 20 years ago, M&E, of course, everybody is doing M&E. Now we have M&E experts, right? And I see the same going on with scaling. Scaling is something that has to be taken seriously in its own right, and it is. So that's very good. In the last 10, 20 years, you see a much more clarity on unpacking this black box. Very many developments on the science of scaling. And that is, of course, a bridge to the next webinar in August, where IITA and IDRC are going to talk about the science of scaling. Much more conceptual clarity also on things like responsible scaling, sustainability, system change within scaling. Another thing which has been really picking up in the last 10 years are the communities of practice. Communities of practice of scaling itself has been growing a lot. The interest from, for example, the big data in scaling, this is really great development. Many organizations are having their scaling units now slowly, or scaling doctors to support different projects. And you see a lot of tools coming up, and tools especially designed to facilitate discussion with local actors about what scaling is and what it takes to do it, and what it involves. And last but not least, you also see a move in funding and also in implementation of scaling. And if you read, for example, the tender documents of Skoll Foundation or Co-Impact, they're very focused on scaling with a very strong system view in that. It's very great to read that. Also implementers, CRS, for example, are taking scaling very seriously now. SNV, the Netherlands, for example, they said, okay, well, we're not going to count farmers anymore. Well, we're going to still count farmers, but we're going to do something more. We define success if other financial resources are leveraged. When we kickstart markets that are sustaining themselves, when governments are basically adopting our approaches, and when we change the new normal. This is success for SNV. For example, you see this with other organizations. Sahel Consulting, also very interesting approaches, and they really focus on this scaling in a more meaningful way of scaling. Takeaways. So scaling approaches high adoption, like the simple definition of it, basically leads to piecemeal innovation. You have maybe an improvement somewhere here, and unsustainable impact mostly goes away very quickly. So there's really a need to shift to a more meaningful scaling, where innovations are the means to an end and not the end in itself. And we also have to go beyond reaching many, as always this key metric of success, and be guided by principles of sustainability, system change, and also very strongly responsible scaling. And to me, it sounds a little bit like, okay, we all have this in our vision and mission statement. We all want to end poverty. We want to put insecurity, etc. Let's say that's the moon, but we're still kind of driving the car, no? We're not really picking up from Earth, because we're still focused so much on these, let's say, farmer beneficiaries, counting them and seeing what they're doing, and not seeing that amount of farmers as a result of the other kind of work that you're doing, the system work that you're doing. So another two last points, don't just pilot the innovation, but really pilot the scaling. So really see scaling as something that you need to pilot. How can you design stuff in a way, the project in a way that when the project ends, the thing continues to grow even faster than without you, right? How can you ensure that the project doesn't stop because of funding stops, but how can you incorporate, for example, accessing market finance for those projects and local actors to continue what they're doing? There's a major challenge, like I said, about evidence for sustainable change at scale. And I think that's holding back a little bit organizations moving to that side of the spectrum. And maybe this is something where the big data platform people can contribute. And that's maybe something for the discussion part. So I feel that we're kind of like reaching a very nice place where we want to be, a very healthy place of development, but we still have to struggle a bit through the jungle, cut our way through the jungle to get there. So yeah, thank you so much for your interest. This is the last slide. Again, the science of scaling, next webinar is on the 25th of August. You're happily invited to join our community of practice. Please email me, and we're also active on Twitter. I just want to refer to 2 documents here. There are many things that I refer to, but I think this is a very interesting one. A good starter's kit is the Scale Up source book. There's a link, and this article describes a little bit what I did here in the presentation. So thank you so much, and I'm handing over to Daniel. Thank you so much.
Hi, Lennart. Thank you so much. Very interesting presentation. I think, Diana, we will head right to you now for your presentation. You're on mute, Diana.
Yes, let me share the screen.
Thank you.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Perfect.
Perfect. Thanks, Maria Camila. I'm very happy to be here to tell you about our work in connecting climate information with the agricultural sector for decision making through the Technical Agro-Climatic Committees, MTAs, and the Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture in Latin America, where the farmers' engagement is the paramount for climate service success. But why do I mention our work? Because in 8 years of working in climate services for agriculture, there are more than 260 institutions involving in the Technical Agro-Climatic Committees in Latin America. How mentioned, Lennart, is the MTAs is like the tandem concept. Imagine that you are riding a tandem bicycle. This requires coordination, collaboration, and communication between the riders to get to their destination. In the same way, to embed the MTAs within the institutional and decision context for long-term sustainability requires key indicators. But let me begin by explaining what the Technical Agro-Climatic Committees is. MTA is a dialogue process among a diversity of local institutions, public and private sector, government, NGOs, researchers, extension services, and farmers, seeking to understand the expected changes in the climate of their regions, how can affect their crops, and what they can do to reduce the negative impacts. This dialogue is used to generate an agroclimatical bulletin where, for example, the agricultural agents are benefiting for better understanding and through contributing to the translation of climate information into concrete agricultural recommendations. In more details, during each meeting or committee, the agrometeorology teams, these teams involve meteorologists of the National and Meteorological Service and agricultural researchers working together to share the agroclimatical forecast. Then the MTA stakeholders meet in groups to analyze how crops will be affected based on the forecast presented, their own experience and knowledge to make recommendations that facilitated decision-making according to the climate conditions foreseen for the following months. For example, in Honduras, in Central America, the committees are every 3 months. In Colombia, every month. And this depends on the context. In other words, means that the MTAs is not an extrapolated linear approach. Each MTAs is built and adapted to the context of each territory. This graph shows the timeline and the most relevant milestone of the Agro-Climatic Technical Committees, born as a pilot in 2013, becoming a successful transition from pilot to a scale. To summarize a long story, I like to point out two interesting details. First, the South-South exchange between Colombia and Honduras to Senegal to witness innovative participatory approaches to bring seasonal climate forecasts to farmers for better agricultural management. As a result for this exchange, a project with the Ministry of Agriculture for the implementation of 3 MTAs in Colombia as a pilot. So, for 3 years of building this approach, CICAF empowers national institutions to lead and sustain the process. It is when in 2015, the MTAs become a commitment of the country in the national determinate contributions. The second point is that MTAs start to scale in a top-down approach in Honduras. But however, our questions was whether the farmers use the climate information provided to them, and if yes, how. We realized that there is a gap between climate information, knowledge, and its used by farmers. And for this reason, we started working a bottom-up approach with the farmers. This map shows the location of the 35 MTAs in 10 countries, where through monitoring process have resulted in more than 330,000 farmers being able to access agroclimatic information to support planning and decision-making in their crops. To sum up, the Agro-Climatic Technical Committees, the NTA's approach, has the necessary ingredients to provide climate services for agriculture as a system that is sustainable and scalable. Ingredients such as structure and government of the MTAs, resources, communication, collaboration, and most importantly, connected to the local needs and requirements in the territories. I'd like to emphasize that a concern with the concept of demand-driven services is that it might be too narrow because farmers are not always aware of the new technologies, innovations, or new knowledge that they could demand. For this, the MTAs and PICS approach helps to build capacities to stimulate the farmers to consider a good decision-making, implementing a range of innovations using an interface between the farmers and the extension agents or local institutions. Because it's important because this involves much more than the provide information. There are other elements in a farmer's decision making to consider. And I agree with Lennart, it's not just reaching numbers. We should consider the 3 dimensions, the scale, sustainability, and the system change. My next slides describe how the MTAs transform the system with some example in 4 areas. After conducting the outcome harvesting, 140 changes were identified as a result of the MTA's implementation. Here are a summary of the most relevant, and you can find more information on this link. It's a working paper. And the transformation area 1 is the information is known, understandable, and connected through the MTAs, where the confidence of the stakeholders, organization, and farmers in local climate information has been strengthened, leading to better integration in the decision-making process. Also, the IRI, the International Research Institute for Climate and Society in New York, work in enhancing the skills of the meteorological services where the MTAs are implemented. The second transformation area is the national and institutional policy changes. Here there are three relevant milestones. First is the MTAs are part of the NDCs in Colombia. Honduras signed a ministerial agreement for the MTA establishment. And now MTAs as part of the regional strategy for disaster risk management in the agricultural sector and food and nutrition security in Latin America and the Caribbean. The next transformation area is knowledge democratizations with the MTA participants, with the farmer groups. That involve participatory decision-making tools. The farmers decide under the context how best to manage their crops, consider agroclimatic information in a co-learning process. In other words, to build capacities to stimulate farmers, consider and then implement a range of innovation using a sustainable interface between the all MTA participants. Finally, the transformation area 4 is changes in productive practices involve the farmer's decision made after participating in MTAs and PICSA process, changing the planting day, showing a new variety or diversify, changing the scale of their crops, reduce or change inputs for pest and disease management, water management, among other practices. And here are two case studies well documented that result in avoided economic losses in rice. And the other case studies is an increase in bean yield. However, in 8 years of MTA's implementations, we have many lessons learned and challenge we face. The first is the time horizons. Some MTAs in 1 or 2 countries are sustained through a pilot projects, do not mature, and when the project ends or the government changes, we have problems with the sustainability of the MTAs. Also, the turnover of personnel in institutions, especially in the meteorological services, is high, which makes a process of skill development very difficult. The other challenge is gender. Remember that the Agro-Climatic Technical Committees is an inclusive open space where everyone can participate. Indeed, in some MTAs, most participants are women. However, we need to pay more attention in some social difference such as gender, pay attention in the roles, responsibilities, and daily activities carried out by women and men because they have different needs and access and response to climate information. The other challenge, this is amazing because youth participation in the MTAs and their engagement with the ICTs has been fascinated. The youth design the agroclimatical bulletins, create training space beyond the MTAs, on topics of interest, such crop models or analyze climate informations. And the other thing, as the young people that participated in the MTAs transfer the Agro-Climatic Bulletin in short audios or infographies or videos. However, most rural households don't have access to the internet, and this is evident now with the COVID-19, where many children don't have access to computer or connection to take their big virtual classes. For this, I think that the benefits of public and private partnerships could be a good option to explore in the MTA's approach. While MTAs carry two evaluation process through an outcome harvesting approach, also monitoring through surveys at the end of the MTA meeting, monitoring and evaluation is complex. It requires time and resources that the MTA's leading institution don't consider. And finally, the challenge at the first mile. The farmers must not be considered merely to be passive recipients of informations, products, or service development. The climate service must fit their context and meet farmers' need. Working as a system is important. It's not follow a linear approach. We need to consider the linkages, the feedback, and include a continuous knowledge exchange and learning. For this, it's relevant to work with farmers in a parallel process to support decision-making based on agroclimatical information provided for the MTAs. And this is my two slides. The pictures illustrated some of the activities that are carried in the MTA's meetings. We have a step-by-step manual in Spanish, in English, that guides the process of implementing an MTAs. And here is the parallel process that I mentioned, carried out by the MTA institution with their farmers, implementing participatory integrated process, such as the PICS approach. PICS is Participatory Integrated Climate Services for Agriculture, to connect the agroclimatical information from the MTA with the farmers' decision-making context. This is my presentation. Thanks for listening, and happy to answer your questions and of course receive your feedback. More information in the links of this presentation of the web. There are blogs, videos, testimonial, case study, and of course in the Twitter, or you can send me an email. Thanks.
Thank you, Diana. And thank you, Lennart, also for introducing us to your work. So I see we have some questions already, so let's start. So first question we have is for Lennart. So question from Ollie at GAIN. How do you think we find the balance between scaling innovations after successful pilots versus piloting further new innovations? It seems important that people in innovation roles continue to focus on experimentation, but we don't want pilots to become one-offs with no long-term benefit.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is
perfect.
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think it comes back to the role. As an innovator, if you come up, for example, with a typewriter now, you have a sorry, I have my videos on now. Yeah, good question. I think we have to see, okay, what is the distinction between the roles? Roles as an innovator and coming up with innovations that are basically ready to scale, that can go to scale. If you're innovating now and coming up with a great typewriter, it probably is not very scalable now because everybody's using computers. So there's one thing, okay, researchers should be in their lab and do their experimentation, but also I think you should also look at really what is required, what is the demand, right? So this is a very blunt example, but in terms of scaling, it really comes down to, yeah, what actually do you want to, achieve? And there is, of course, the wait, I'm losing my train of thought here. There's a role for an experimenting to do your experimentation to get something good, right? But what we're saying is that the scalability of something doesn't really depend only on the innovation itself. The innovation alone is not enough. You need to have something that can work in the basically the environment that you design it for. And to do that, you need to collaborate with many other people, many other disciplines that are part of that. So in doing that, you really need to team up with social scientists, with other kind of scientists, to understand much more what is actually required and how can you develop something that is kind of scalable, right? So that's, I think, an important point. Another thing is very much about collaboration. And I think I saw another question. Maybe I jump straight to the next question because I think it's linked. Is how do you start with this innovation push, or do you go to that system view? I think it's a kind of like a hybrid, right? And it depends on what your strength is. It's important to keep your strength. If your strength is in finding out if an innovation is really working well, that is important because you need to convince others with, for example, strong data that, okay, your yield goes up with this, or the taste is better, or something else. The thing is that it's not enough for scaling. And I think a lot of people make that wrong assumption. Say, well, it's fantastic. Look at the results. Now it's ready to scale. This is one piece of the puzzle. It's an important piece of the puzzle, and it's work that should continue, but it's definitely not enough. So you need to understand much more the environment. And many of our organizations where we all work in are basically geared to come up with one trick, like one innovation or one kind of type of innovation. CGR is very strongly crop focused, right? That we do some very well, but we need to collaborate with others to really bring it to scale and really define what is actually the scale that we want. Right?
Thank you, Lennart. We have a question for Diana. This is a question from Annette. So how are the MTAs governed? Are they decentralized? How are they funded?
Okay, thanks for the questions. Yes, in some contexts in Central America and Honduras and Colombia, in Honduras is a top-down approach, is government with the Ministry of Agriculture. In Colombia too, is centralizing, but this does not mean that the MTAs follow the own approach, is the following or adapted to the context. This is important. And yes, in Colombia and Honduras is government, and the structure is follow the Ministry of Agriculture that implement these MTAs and support with the resource the sustain of the MTAs. In other contexts, depend of the projects, depend of the local governments. This is not a good way because the project ends, and of course the problems with the sustainability of the MTAs. And in other contexts in South America, the MTAs in Paraguay, in Ecuador and Chile, the MTAs is sustained by a big project that carry out the different results or agenda of the different countries.
Thank you, Diana. Next question is for Lennart. So from Apurva, when a systems approach is used for designing a program, what approaches would you recommend for measuring and monitoring impact?
Well, this is really the Achilles heel, I think, the weak spot of the system view, and I think this is basically the major reason why we are very comfortable on that side of the spectrum, where we basically count farmers using or adopting an innovation, is because it's very difficult to measure what system change is and what do we mean with it, or how sustainable is it. Sustainability you can only measure basically after the project is over, which is very difficult. Donors don't like to pay for those kind of projects where you say, well, We don't know the project, the impact will be later. So this is, to me, if there's a smart person on this call, and I'm sure there are, this is really the key issue. There are some approaches which I think very promising, and Diana showed one, used one, is this outcome harvesting, where you really go beyond the numbers and you really look at what kind of changes have actually taken place, and not changes within the project, but what changes have happened that people are going to do irrespective of the project, irrespective of you, because they think this is a good thing and I'm going to do it in my next project, I'm going to do it in my personal life. Another strong movement coming up is this blue marble innovation. I suggest that you look at it. They have a very nice community of practice where they also see the blue marble is the idea of you look from the space to the earth and you only see a blue marble, right? So there are no boundaries. Basically, you have a very system view. These are methods that are really coming up strongly, and I think they're very promising, but they're not used much yet. I think Diana gave a great example of how you can use them. These are, I think, interesting things, but it is, to me, that's why I think we're in the jungle. We're still cutting our way through the forest because we don't have a lot of convincing data to show just the way that we show this is adopted and that is not adopted, which is also up for discussion, of course. We don't have a way to say, okay, this is a system change and that is not a system change. So it's still a bit fluffy, but we are getting there. And I think in 10 years from now, we look back at this and we laugh about this discussion probably.
Thank you, Lennart. So we have lots of questions and little time, unfortunately. So I'm going to just wrap up with a couple of more questions, and then we'll pass the ball to Daniel to do the wrap up, and we will eventually get all the answers to you. We're so sorry, but we'll ask a couple more questions, and so we can continue. So this one is for Lennart from Mira. Could you please explain how best pilot the scaling should be implemented when working in a research project? Example, restoration of degraded land, and test it if we don't control other factors?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think the first thing is that you have to be clear with your team and with your stakeholders. What actually is the scale that we want to achieve? What is scale? Is it entire Tunisia? Is it entire Northern Africa? Are we talking about a few localities? Are we talking about millions of farmers? Are we talking about 100,000 farmers? And I think once you have to have that discussion, you can reverse back kind of, okay, if we want to have this operational in 10 years from now, in 5 years from now, what do we need to do now to prepare the local stakeholders to keep on doing that? Because we can push it now, but we're not going to be there forever, right? And really scaling takes place after the project, when the things are really developing from themselves with other initiatives coming together. Many things in most of the projects where we try to look at this, finance is a major issue. Most of us in our researchers in agricultural research, we don't know much about finance, but it's a key issue for local stakeholders and for scaling. But we basically say, well, this is for somebody else, right? Business models is another key issue that we tend not to look so much at. Why would somebody provide those seeds of those forages to those farmers in these far-off villages? Well, because we pay them project money to do that, right? Would they do that also without the project money? So you can pilot that. Pilot a model within your project. How can you pilot, for example, those seed providers to do that kind of service without external funding or funding from other sources or something that they can do? So these are kind of things. Reverse back, where do you want to go? Do you have what do you need at that last day so that you can basically say, well, on the 31st of December, I'm out, guys. And then the things will go on. So reverse engineer, but have a very clear ambition of what the scale is, and have that discussed also with the local stakeholders and come up with a realistic scaling ambition is a key step.
Perfect, thank you, Lennart. So I see we have lots of questions, and we will save these and we will get back to you. We will review them with our speakers and we will definitely get back to you. But thank you all for writing down your questions. I just want to have something cleared up for everyone. So remember, the link to the recording will be shared through our social media channel.